middle of the 16th century, the name Medici echoed through every court, every cathedral, and every counting house in Europe. A family that had begun as peasant farmers in the Tuscan countryside had, over the course of barely 2 centuries, produced Grand Dukes, Queens of France, and 4 popes. Their bankers had lent money to kings fighting wars from England to Naples. Their patronage had funded Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Leonardo da Vinci, and their political scheming had shaped the destiny of nations. Few dynasties in the history of the world have cast such a long shadow. This is the story of the House of Medici, from their humble origins in the hills north of Florence to their rise as one of the most powerful and fascinating families the world has ever known. The Medici family traced their roots to a small agricultural settlement called Cafaggiolo in Tuscany, lying roughly 20 kilometers north of Florence. The name itself gives us a clue about their earliest origins. In the 12th and 13th centuries, as surnames began to spread across Europe, most families took their names either from the place they lived or from the trade they practiced. The name Medici derives from the Italian word for doctor or healer, suggesting that some early ancestor of the family worked in medicine, though no record of who this person was has ever been found. Whatever folk remedies they may have practiced, what matters is that the family were originally of peasant stock, but they were ambitious peasant stock. By the dawn of the 14th century, they had accumulated enough wealth to begin lending money at interest, a small but crucial step that would eventually transform them into one of the most powerful banking dynasties in European history. The world into which the Medici were rising was one of extraordinary contradictions. The High Middle Ages, roughly spanning the years between 1000 and 1300, had seen Europe develop enormously in terms of commerce, culture, and governance. Italy sat at the center of this transformation. Its great trading cities, Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Florence, dominated Mediterranean commerce. Universities were appearing in Bologna and Pisa. The first stirrings of what we now call the Renaissance were already being felt. Dante Alighieri, a Florentine, wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century. Francesco Petrarch and Giovanni Boccaccio were laying the foundations of Italian humanism. Painters like Giotto were revolutionizing European art, but Italy was also a brutal and dangerous place. The peninsula was carved up into dozens of competing city-states, the most powerful of which were the Papal States in central Italy, the Kingdom of Naples in the south, and the republics of Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Milan in the north. Military mercenaries known as condottieri carved out power for themselves wherever they could find it, and overshadowing all of this cultural vitality was the catastrophic famine of 1315 to 1317, followed 30 years later by the Black Death, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population. It was in this world, violent, brilliant, and precarious in equal measure, that the Medici would make their name. The first members of the family to appear in the historical record were already established in Florence in the early 14th century, working in the banking trade. Italian banking was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. Banks in the Italian city-states had developed credit notes, long-distance lending networks, and systems of exchange that facilitated trade across the entire Mediterranean world. One early Medici banker, Cosimo de Medici, was already prosperous by the 1350s, though the family's wealth was still modest compared to what it would become. The political ambitions of the wider family were also beginning to stir. Another member of the Medici clan, Salvestro, served as Gonfaloniere of Florence, effectively the head of the city's Republican Council, and became embroiled in the Ciompi Revolt of 1378, a fierce struggle between the city's wealthiest citizens and its artisans and tradespeople. The fact that Salvestro sided with the wealthy elite tells us something important about how the family now saw themselves. Despite their peasant origins barely a century before, they had firmly cast their lot with Florence's ruling class. As Salvestro navigated that turbulent political moment, a younger member of the family was entering adulthood. Giovanni de Medici was one of the sons of Averardo de Medici, who had died young and divided his business interests among his heirs. Giovanni received only a modest share of this inheritance, but what he lacked in initial capital, he more than made up for in shrewdness. Over the following decades, he painstakingly built up his financial operations, absorbed other branches of the family's banking activities, and transformed what had been a collection of loosely related lending businesses into a coherent, powerful institution, the Medici Bank. He expanded it aggressively through the 1390s, 1400s, and 1410s, capitalizing on the almost endless appetite for credit created by the Italian Wars, the Papal Schism, which had produced rival popes in Rome and Avignon, and the renewed growth in long-distance trade that followed the devastation of the Black Death. By the time Giovanni died in 1429, he had built the Medici Bank into one of the foremost financial institutions in all of Italy. The business passed to his son Cosimo, and it was Cosimo who would change everything. Cosimo de Medici was born on the 27th of September 1389 in Florence. He had been involved in his father's affairs since at least his early 20s, and the transition of power when Giovanni died in 1429 was seamless. But Cosimo was more than a capable banker. He was a visionary who understood that in the city-state politics of Renaissance Italy, wealth alone was not enough. Power had to be built carefully, quietly, and without provoking unnecessary enemies. Unlike the brutal strongmen who had seized control of cities like Milan, Cosimo chose not to dismantle Florence's republican institutions. He left the councils and the guilds formally in place, and instead worked to ensure that his allies and family members occupied the key positions within them. He became, in all but name, the first citizen of Florence, the man to whom everyone ultimately answered, while maintaining the fiction of republican government. This was not easy. Florence had other powerful families, the Pazzi, the Albizzi, the Strozzi, who resented Medici dominance and formed anti-Medici factions within the city. In 1433, they succeeded in having Cosimo exiled from Florence, convincing their fellow citizens that he had grown too powerful. It was a short-lived victory. Within a year, Cosimo had used his network of allies and the leverage of his bank's financial power to have the decision reversed. He returned to Florence in 1434, stronger than before. What set Cosimo apart from other powerful merchants and political bosses of his era was his extraordinary commitment to culture and learning. Florence had already established itself as the cradle of the Renaissance, but Cosimo poured resources into it on a scale that no single individual had previously attempted. He hired the architect Michelangelo to design and build the Palazzo Medici, a magnificent urban palace in the heart of the city that would serve as a model for palaces across Italy for generations. He commissioned Donatello to produce some of the most remarkable sculptures of the age, including the famous bronze statue of David, the first freestanding nude statue created since the fall of the Roman Empire. Medieval religious convention had forbidden nudity in art. Donatello's David, standing in the courtyard of the Medici Palace, declared that a new age had arrived. Cosimo also funded teams of humanist scholars to travel across Europe and the Byzantine Empire, searching monastic libraries and private collections for lost manuscripts of ancient Greek and Roman authors. Scholars who worked under his patronage included Niccolò Niccoli, Leonardo Bruni, and Poggio Bracciolini. Among the practical results of this program of cultural investment was the development, by Niccoli, of a new style of handwriting designed to make texts easier to read. We call it italics today, and it still appears on every word processor in the world. In 1439, Cosimo hosted the Council of Florence, a major ecclesiastical gathering aimed at healing the centuries-old schism between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. The goal was to unite Christendom so that the weakening Byzantine Empire might receive Western military help against the advancing Ottoman Turks. While the theological agreement reached at Florence was ultimately rejected by the Orthodox hierarchy back in Constantinople, the council had enormous cultural consequences. The Greek delegation included leading scholars and philosophers who reintroduced Platonic and Neoplatonic thought to Florence. Inspired by these encounters, Cosimo established a Platonic academy in the city, dedicating it to the study of ancient philosophy. His grandson would later estimate that the family spent the equivalent of more than $500 million in today's money on arts patronage and cultural projects during this period alone. And that figure did not include the Medici Bank's wider commercial activities, which by the 1440s extended north of the Alps to branches in Lyon, Geneva, and Bruges, with even a branch in London lending money to both sides during the Wars of the Roses. Cosimo de Medici died in 1464, aged 74. He was succeeded by his son Piero, a man plagued by gout and poor health who died only 5 years later. But the family's story was far from over, because Piero was succeeded by his son Lorenzo, and Lorenzo de Medici would prove to be one of the most remarkable individuals of the entire Renaissance age. Before we continue with the extraordinary story of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Pazzi Conspiracy, and the rise of the Medici popes, if you are enjoying this documentary, now is a great time to subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. We release new documentary histories of Europe's greatest dynasties and royal houses regularly, and subscribing ensures you never miss one. And if you are watching this as part of our House of series, the links to the rest of the series are in the description below. Now, back to Florence, and to Lorenzo de Medici. Lorenzo de Medici was born on the 1st of January 1449. He was still a young man when he succeeded his father as head of the bank and the family in 1469, but he proved almost immediately that he had inherited the intelligence and instincts of his grandfather Cosimo. Over the following 2 decades, he transformed the Medici from a family that quietly controlled Florence through commercial and political networks into a major force in the wider politics of Italy, forming and breaking alliances with popes and foreign powers, and acquiring a reputation across Europe as a ruler of extraordinary sophistication. He became known as Lorenzo il Magnifico, Lorenzo the Magnificent, a title that was not given to him by later historians but used by his contemporaries during his own lifetime. Lorenzo's patronage of the arts built on everything Cosimo had established, but gave it a personal dimension that made it legendary. Among the artists and thinkers who flourished under his protection were Sandro Botticelli, whose paintings The Birth of Venus and La Primavera are among the most recognizable works of the entire Renaissance, almost certainly commissioned by the Medici family. Lorenzo also supported Andrea del Verrocchio, whose workshop in Florence trained a young apprentice named Leonardo da Vinci, and in the final years of his life, he identified another extraordinarily gifted young artist and brought him to live at the Palazzo Medici, a 17-year-old sculptor named Michelangelo. The fact that a city of perhaps 50,000 people was simultaneously home to Botticelli, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, all at the height of their powers or at the very beginning of what would become extraordinary careers, is itself a testament to what Medici patronage had created in Florence. Lorenzo was also a scholar and poet in his own right, a man who understood ideas not merely as ornaments to his power, but as ends in themselves. He continued his grandfather's support for the Platonic Academy and its leading philosopher Marsilio Ficino, whose works on Platonic philosophy, produced in the 1470s and 1480s under Medici patronage, would influence European thought for generations. But Lorenzo's Florence was not only a city of beauty and ideas, it was also a city of danger. In 1478, the most dramatic crisis of his rule arrived without warning. The Pazzi family, one of the Medici's oldest rivals, had been quietly building an alliance against them for years. Together with their associates and with the tacit support of Pope Sixtus IV, they conceived a plot to assassinate Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano and seize control of the city. They chose their moment with a kind of audacious brutality. Sunday Mass at Florence Cathedral, one of the most sacred public spaces in the city. As the Medici brothers knelt in prayer on the morning of the 26th of April 1478, the conspirators struck. Giuliano was killed on the spot, stabbed multiple times. Lorenzo managed to escape into the sacristy where the heavy bronze doors were barred behind him. What followed in the hours and days after the assassination attempt revealed the other side of Lorenzo the Magnificent. He responded with a ferocity that left no doubt about the price of moving against the House of Medici. The Pazzi and their conspirators were hunted down across the city. Jacopo de Pazzi was eventually tortured and beheaded, his body dragged through the streets. Several of the conspirators were hanged from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Pope excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict. Lorenzo faced it down, and when the dust settled, his position in Florence was stronger than it had ever been. The Pazzi Conspiracy had failed completely. After 1478, no one in Florence any longer pretended that the Republic was governed by anyone other than Lorenzo de Medici. For all his greatness, Lorenzo's personal health was fragile. He suffered throughout his adult life from what medical historians now believe was acromegaly, a condition in which the body produces excessive amounts of growth hormone, and he died in 1492 at just 43 years of age. His death came at a moment of gathering crisis. The Italian states were about to be plunged into a long and destructive period of warfare as France and Spain began competing for control of the peninsula. The man who would have to navigate that storm was Lorenzo's son Piero, and he was not equal to the task. In 1494, the French King Charles V invaded Italy with a large army, moving south through Tuscany on his way to claim the Kingdom of Naples. Piero de Medici, facing a French force he could not hope to resist militarily, tried to negotiate safe passage, and in doing so, agreed to surrender several Tuscan fortresses to French control. When he returned to Florence and presented these terms to the city council, the reaction was explosive. The fiery Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola had been preaching with increasing intensity against the corruption of the Medici and the moral decay of Florence, and the citizens were ready to listen. Piero was driven from the city, the Republican government was restored, the House of Medici appeared to have fallen. It had not. For the next 18 years, various members of the family worked to rebuild their position from exile, cultivating alliances in Venice, Rome, and beyond. The decisive moment came in 1512, when Giovanni de Medici, a younger son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who had become a cardinal of the church, used a combination of papal and Spanish military support to engineer a return to power in Florence. He did so without a siege, without a massacre, and without destroying the fabric of the city. It was a masterpiece of political management, but Giovanni had no intention of spending his life governing Florence. He had his eyes on a far greater prize. When Pope Julius II died in February 1513, the papal conclave that gathered to elect his successor chose Giovanni de Medici. At 37 years of age, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent became Pope Leo X, the first Medici pope. It was an astonishing elevation, and his time as head of the Roman Catholic Church would have consequences that echoed across the entire world. In order to finance ambitious building projects in Rome, including the construction of the new St. Peter's Basilica, Leo dramatically increased the sale of papal indulgences, documents sold by the Church for the remission of sins. The backlash came from an Augustinian monk in Germany named Martin Luther, who in 1517 nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. The Protestant Reformation had begun. A century and a half of religious warfare would follow across Europe. That was the legacy of the first Medici pope. Leo died in December 1521. 2 years later, the family reclaimed the papacy through Leo's cousin, Giulio de Medici, who was elected as Pope Clement VII in November 1523. Clement's papacy was one of the most turbulent in the history of the Church. The Protestant Reformation was spreading rapidly beyond Germany, into Switzerland, Scandinavia, and England. And in May 1527, the troops of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, largely unpaid and effectively mutinous, sacked the city of Rome in one of the most shocking events of the 16th century. For months, Rome was occupied and looted. Clement was effectively a prisoner. His inability to grant King Henry the Finney of England an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Charles V's aunt, contributed directly to England's break with Rome and the creation of the Church of England. The ripple effects of that decision are still felt today. Before he died in 1534, Clement took a step that would alter the trajectory of the Medici family permanently. He arranged the marriage of his young cousin Catherine de Medici to Henry, the second son of King Francis I of France. What had initially appeared to be a useful diplomatic alliance became something far greater in 1536, when Henry's older brother died unexpectedly. making Henry heir to the French throne. In 1547, he became King Henry II of France, and Catherine de Medici became Queen of France. The following decades saw Catherine emerge as one of the most powerful and controversial women of the 16th century. Her husband died in a jousting accident in 1559, and she became the dominant political figure of France during the reigns of three of her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III. The France she tried to govern was tearing itself apart in the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. Her attempts to navigate these conflicts led her to decisions that history has judged harshly. The most notorious was her role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of August 1572, when thousands of French Protestants were killed in Paris and across the country. Catherine died in January 1589, just months before her last surviving son was assassinated, bringing the Valois dynasty to an end. But the Medici connection to France was not finished. Henry IV, the new King of France and founder of the Bourbon dynasty, needed a bride, and so in 1600 he married Marie de Medici, niece of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. For the second time in half a century, a Medici woman sat on the throne of France. Marie gave birth to the future King Louis III and ensured that Medici blood flowed in the veins of the French royal family down to the time of the Revolution. Through her daughter Henrietta Maria, who married King Charles I of England, that bloodline extended even further across Europe. Back in Italy, the Medici ruled Florence and Tuscany with increasing security but declining inspiration. Cosimo I, who came to power in 1537 following the assassination of his predecessor, Alessandro, was an effective if ruthless ruler who eventually elevated his title to Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569. Later Grand Dukes had their moments. Ferdinando II notably defended the astronomer Galileo against the fury of the Inquisition and founded one of the earliest scientific academies in Europe. But the family was fading. The economic center of gravity in Europe had shifted northward. The great Italian trading cities that had made families like the Medici fabulously wealthy were now secondary players in a world increasingly dominated by the Atlantic trade routes and the commercial empires of England and the Dutch Republic. The final chapter of the House of Medici as a ruling dynasty was defined not by military defeat or political revolution, but by something far simpler and far more human: the failure to produce heirs. By the early 18th century, the male line was dying out across all the main branches of the family. The last Grand Duke, Giangaston de Medici, succeeded to the title in 1723, already in his mid-50s. His marriage to Anna Maria Francisca of Saxe-Lauenburg had been contracted decades earlier for financial rather than dynastic reasons and had produced no children. The couple had largely lived apart for years, their marriage a quiet study in mutual unhappiness. Giangastone died in 1737 without an heir, and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany passed to Francis of the House of Habsburg. After more than 3 centuries, Medici rule in Florence was over. And yet the family's story did not end entirely there. Junior branches of the Medici survived and continue to hold noble titles in Italy to the present day. The descendants of Marie de Medici sat on the throne of France until the Revolution. Through the intricate web of European royal marriages, Medici blood ran through the veins of rulers across the continent for generations after the last Grand Duke closed his eyes. And of course the art, the staggering, almost incomprehensible art, remains. Walk through the Uffizi Gallery in Florence today, and you are walking through what was once a Medici administrative building, now housing the greatest collection of Renaissance masterwork in the world. The bronzes of Donatello, the paintings of Botticelli, the sculptures Michelangelo first learned to carve under Medici patronage, all of it endures because a family of Tuscan peasants had the ambition to become bankers, the intelligence to become patrons, and the vision to understand that beauty, like money, has a power of its own. The House of Medici defeated by time and biology in the end, as all dynasties are, but their fingerprints are on the Renaissance itself, on the art that shaped Western civilization, on the religious conflicts that divided Europe for a century and a half, and on the royal bloodlines of France and England. Few families have done more, for better and for worse, to make the modern world what it is. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary on the House of Medici, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more people discover this channel. And if you want to be notified every time we release a new documentary in the House of series, make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on. We have covered the houses of Windsor, Tudor, Plantagenet, Romanov, Habsburg and Bourbon, all available on this channel now. Drop a comment below and let us know which dynasty you would like us to cover next. We read every single one. Until next time,